The urban-rural divide is an extraordinarily complicated issue touching on deep-seated historical, cultural, and economic contexts. But I think what we heard today from Senator Scarnati is the urban solutions are oftentimes the rural solutions as well, that we all have more in common than we give ourselves credit for thinking. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Jay Shambaugh, who is the director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institute. And he's going to present research from the project's analysis called the Geography of Prosperity, and how those tools can be used to aid policymakers in more succinctly identifying where communities are thriving and struggling at the state and county level. Dr. Shambaugh is, he's the director of the Hamilton Project and a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. He's also a professor of economics and international affairs at the Elliot School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's spent 2 stints in public service. Most recently, he served as a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, where he was involved in policy related to international economics, macroeconomics, competition policy, energy and environment policy, housing, finance, and technology. He served as a first senior economist for the International Economics and then chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors from 2009 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shambaugh.
Thanks very much, and I really want to thank the Institute of Politics for having me here, Chancellor Nordenberg and Samantha for inviting me. This looks like a great program. I'm really happy to be part of it. What I'm going to talk about today is, as mentioned, regional inequality and shared economic growth. So, as Samantha mentioned, I'm the director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings. It's basically a small think tank within a think tank, and one of the things we try to do is do economic research that is aimed at policy, not necessarily aimed at academia, and then also, frankly, try to pull academics who are experts on topics and get them to write things that policymakers might want to read. And the goal there is to say, honestly, sometimes we say to them, you know, you don't need to write one more article that no one's going to read. Could you please write something people could actually understand and try to maybe have some positive effects in the world? And so what we did in this project is we have a book called the Place-Based Policies for Shared Economic Growth. And the point in the book was to notice the extent to which regional inequality, and when I say regional, it's not just across broad regions of the economy, but across place, really, how the gaps have gotten bigger and how we probably need to put more energy behind the policies that could address this. So what I'll talk about today is first, talk a little bit about these current gaps, talk about the changing patterns of convergence across places, and then get into some of the factors that have influenced kind of economic success in different places. I'll spend a little bit of time towards the end talking about one chapter in this book that talks about the intersection of racial and regional inequality that I think is an important topic to raise also, and then at the end talk about policy options a little bit. So the first thing to talk about here, these kind of current gaps in outcomes across places. So if this is a table where we took data on counties and we kind of grouped them into kind of sort all the counties, and then on each of these measures look at the top fifth or the top quintile and the bottom fifth and look at the average. And one of the things you see if you look at the top line, you see that median household income is literally twice as high in the top quintile of counties compared to the bottom quintile of counties. Just a massive difference in economic resources available to people in those communities. The poverty rate is almost 3 times as high in the worst performing counties. But one thing I do want to highlight here is that second number, you know, anyone who studies poverty would say, wow, 8%, that's great. I would love it if we could have a poverty rate of 8%. But that still means in the top performing places, 8% of people are in poverty. Right, so it's not to say we shouldn't just look at a place and say this place is successful and everyone's life is great, or for that matter, this place is struggling in some ways and so no one's having good economic success there. There's a huge amount of variance kind of within a region, within a county, all the way down to kind of the census tract. And so even in the places that are doing well on poverty, there's still a lot of people that are struggling. The unemployment rate is different. I want to talk about this one that sounds more like jargon, which is prime age EPOP. So when we say prime age, it's always touchy because then people say, wait, are you saying I'm past my prime in some way? And this is kind of a labor economics jargon for people who are almost all working by their age group. So it's age 25 to 54. You kind of figure you're probably done with schooling by 25, or at least a lot of people are, and you're probably not thinking about retirement yet. And so it's kind of in that sweet spot we say, well, this really most people should be working. And if you go back in times amongst prime age males in the US, that number would be like 96, 97% were working, so, or at least in the labor force. And so looking at this number, one of the things that's just shocking is you're at 83% in this top group of counties and 67 at the other. And to put that in context, the national prime age employment rate fell around 5 percentage points in the Great Recession. We threw everything we could macroeconomically. People were panicking about that drop of 5 percentage points. The gap between the top performing counties and the bottom performing counties is like 3 Great Recession shocks all at once. And so I think it's one of those things that should really highlight the extent to which there's a huge amount of need to think about how do we make sure there's demand for labor, how do we make sure people have the skills, the training, the education, and most of all the opportunity to get jobs in a lot of places where there just aren't as many opportunities. And then lastly, the one that I think is really sobering in some ways is the life expectancy. So if you look at the counties with the highest life expectancy, it's around 82 years. The counties with the lowest, it's around 76. It took us over 40 years to have national life expectancy rise 5 years. You're talking about almost going back 4 decades in terms of life expectancy when you move across those groups. And which again, I think is just reminds us the extent to which policies here are needed. So one of the things we did at the Hamilton Project was we tried to say, well, can we kind of pull these things together in some way? And so we created this index that we call the Economic Vitality Index. And so this map is showing you kind of how different counties score on this. And the way you read it is, you want to be blue over here. That means that your county's doing better economically in some sense. It doesn't mean, it's not a, and I think it's always important to talk about this, it's not a value judgment about the community. It's really telling you more, what are the economic opportunities, what are the economic resources available in these communities? And then the ones all the way down to the other orange side aren't doing as well on economic measures. And so when we look across, and just if you're wondering, the reason some are lighter, it's scaled a little bit by population, just because if you don't, especially in the upper Northwest, there are some really huge counties geographically that have very few people, but they'd all be either bright blue or bright orange, and it makes the map really hard to read. So one of the things you can kind of see is what you might have guessed if you hadn't done this work that actually took a long time, which is kind of the Acela corridor there is kind of dark blue with some exceptions around it. And you can kind of see some of the cities around, whether it's Austin or Atlanta or Durham, that are doing well. But not only those places. You see up in kind of Minnesota or certainly up in the Dakotas on economic grounds doing relatively well in 2016. And then you see some other places, though, especially across the stretch of the Southeast, that are on average struggling. And so one of the things we want to do here is talk about how this has changed over time and what's driving some of this. So if you have no interest in statistics, you don't need to listen for the next like 35 seconds, then I'll get back. But if you were wondering how we did this, we used something called confirmatory factor analysis, the point of which is to draw the kind of common signal out of a whole bunch of data. And so the point is this index is supposed to represent, if you threw all these factors in together, what's a good summary statistic of it. And the way it turns out is that median household income is actually a pretty good summary statistic. It's about half of the index, but that being said, that means it's missing about half of the story. And the other things you do want to pay attention to, in particular the poverty rate, as well as the prime age employment rate, become pretty important signals. We tried testing whether we should include other things. The nice thing about this technique is if they don't belong in there, they just get no weight. And so it just doesn't matter. And then we know we don't really need them. And so we used data from the American Community Survey for recent years, as well as census from 1980 to kind of look across. And when you see me put up scores, if it's a 0, that's not bad. A 0 means you're dead at the median. So you're kind of exactly typical in the country. So we've got a map, actually, if you're curious. You can go onto our website and you can click all around. It's interactive. And so these are a few screenshots of it to give us a sense of what's going on. So this is Pennsylvania, as I'm sure everyone here knows. If you read up at the top, you can kind of see what the numbers are. And Pennsylvania, as it turns out, comes really close as a state overall to the national average. It's not booming fantastically, but it's certainly not struggling. Its vitality index on average is a little bit above 0, meaning it's a little bit above the median. And actually, on a whole bunch of the measures, it comes in pretty close, right around household income numbers, right around employment rates, right around life expectancy, things like that. So it winds up being just a little bit above. If you narrow in a little bit more to where we're standing right now in Allegheny County, you can see in the row up above, it's also a little bit above. It's got an index that's positive, so it's a little bit above the typical county, and it kind of tracks across national average in a lot of places. It has a better employment rate of prime-age individuals, Allegheny County does, than the overall country. Its household income is right around typical, a teeny bit below, and that's why when you put it all together, it's fairly close to the national average. And you can see similar scores, actually, if you look at Beaver County here, again, right above. Actually, household income is a little lower than typical for the country, but on other measures in particular, whether it's unemployment or the poverty rate in particular, I think is striking. And this is where you can see some variation. So household income is no higher, but actually the poverty rate is lower than it is in the national average or in Pennsylvania's average. We can also, though, poke around to some of the others right around us. Washington County is quite a bit higher. Actually, it's now a decent amount above the national average, and part of that is just household income is higher. People have higher paying jobs here. The poverty rate is even lower. It's below 10%. And when you put all these things together, it winds up as a county that's doing pretty well on economic grounds. Again, that doesn't mean everyone there is doing well, and there are almost certainly pockets of poverty, as evidenced by the fact that the poverty rate is 10%. But it's a place that on average is doing reasonably well and has resources that it can try to use to kind of make the place even better. If we move a little bit further to Greene County, the economic vitality index goes negative. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, is to look across some of the places where it's negative to think about why. When you look here, the poverty rate isn't actually any higher than the national average, or it's a little bit higher, but it's pretty close to the national average. It's actually the employment rate that's a fair bit below. It's right around 63%, which is a long way from the national average. And so one of the things I think it highlights, and what's interesting is it's not that people are unemployed necessarily. The unemployment rate isn't necessarily any higher. And so what it really speaks to is people have gotten disconnected from the labor force, often because there's just a lack of economic opportunity. There aren't enough jobs. There aren't enough things like community colleges and training centers that can get people into the economy. And so it shows that, you know, on average, it's a place that could use some sorts of work in terms of place-based policies that might provide more of those opportunities and give people better paying jobs and kind of lift some of these statistics. And then I think the last one I was going to run through is Venango County, which is actually, to me, a really interesting one because household income is a lot lower than the national average, and it's one of the reasons the vitality index score is lower, but the poverty rate isn't higher. And so I think it speaks in some way to a lower average income level, but a little bit more smoothly distributed across the county so that you don't have some sort of spike in poverty. And actually what's interesting is the employment rate is quite high. And so, well, it's not higher than the national average, but it's almost right at it. And given the income level, that you might sometimes think it would be lower. And so it's one of the places that I think it highlights that you can see different challenges places face, whether it's a question of having enough jobs that people are able to get into the labor market, or whether it's having enough high-quality jobs where people are earning higher incomes. What I wanted to really jump to, though, oh, sorry, I did have one more, Jefferson County. Which I don't remember what I was going to say about other than it's another place with low household income but high employment rates and low unemployment rates, suggesting in some ways the labor market's working, people are in getting jobs, but doing more to draw high kind of jobs that are employing more high-skilled people that are employing higher income that could bring more resources to the community is important. And then, like I said, if you want to click around and click on your own county or see how it compares to other places, there's lots more there. But what I want to look at quickly is the changing pattern of convergence and why we care about gaps across regions, and I think arguably why we should care a lot more today than maybe people thought they should 40 years ago. And so one of the reasons is if you go back to kind of as far back as we can stretch the statistics, if you go back to 1929, the gaps across regions in the United States are just massive. People in the Southeast, their household incomes are half what they are at the national average. People up in kind of New England or in the Mideast are a good 30, 40% higher. The gaps then from New England to Southeast is just huge. You look, though, kind of play history forward for a while, and these lines all keep getting closer and closer and closer together, right? And so what we're seeing is economic convergence there. The poorest places are growing faster. The richest places, it's not that they're not growing, they're just not growing as fast as the poor places. So you're getting this economic convergence. And so sometimes when people a number of years ago would talk about, well, do we need place-based policies? Do we need to target resources to struggling communities? Sometimes people would say, well, look, they're actually growing faster. I don't know if we want to mess around with this, right? Things are actually improving. Now, some of this is direct policies, as some of the ones mentioned earlier about whether it's rural electrification or things like that, very deliberately targeted at the poorest places, especially in the 20s and 30s. But in general, you're seeing this convergence. But one of the shocking things is just you get to around 1980 and it just stops. And for the last 40 years, the convergence isn't there. If anything, there's a slight divergence. The places that are poorer aren't catching up at all anymore. And that in some ways really highlights the fact that you may need policy to try to make sure the places that are poorer continue to catch up. Another way to look at this, which is a little bit messier depending on how much you like scatter plots, is the figure on the left is showing you household income in 1960 is across the x-axis. So the poorest places are over on the far left. And then the y-axis is how much did household income go up over the next 20 years? And in some ways, if you want poorer places to do better, this is literally, you couldn't draw it any better. This is exactly what you want. The poorest places are growing fastest. The richest places are growing, but not as fast. And so you have that economic convergence. The second picture is from 1980 to 2016. It's just a flat line. Right? The poor places are growing at the same pace as the richer places. And on the one hand, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what it means is the poorer places are staying just as poor. They're not catching up in any dimension. And so we just see this relationship that was very strongly there for 20 years and many years before that, just gone more recently. And by recently, I mean the last 3 or 4 decades. Another way to look at this, or we thought it was interesting to look at it, is with the vitality index. And if you glance at these, you might think there's some sort of typo and I've just put the same picture up twice. It's not. One is the vitality index in 1980 and one is in 2016. And they look really similar. The same places seem to have more economic resources, and there's just not this sense of kind of places reshuffling. There's not a sense of places that were struggling getting a lot more economic resources and showing better performance on job measures and things like this. And the somewhat startling thing is that 92% of the counties that were in the bottom quintile in 1980 are still in the bottom 2 quintiles. You just don't see places that were struggling in 1980 suddenly booming today, or you see a few, but just not very many. So what I want to talk about a little bit is kind of what happened and what looks like are the things that were driving this. So one of the big things that you see, I should have mentioned when you look at these pictures, there are 2 things you actually can see if you squint at the figures a little bit. The first is, if you compare kind of like the Dakotas, especially South Dakota in the first picture, the top one, 1980, it's a little more orange than it is in the bottom one, and that's honestly fracking. And so suddenly, by 2016, there were just more jobs and more economic activity in South Dakota than you had before. But it's one of the few places that you see kind of suddenly jump up. The other one that is probably more relevant to this room is if you look around the Great Lakes, in the top figure, there's more blue. And when you look in the bottom figure, there's just not as much. There's still some, but not as much. And that is kind of the what often gets referred to as the shock that hit the Rust Belt and a slowdown in economic activity in these places. You can see it kind of city by city with the very, very interesting and relevant nationally, but especially if you're in this room here, exception being Pittsburgh. Right? So if you look at the first few, you see Detroit, you see Flint, you see Youngstown, you see Cleveland, and you see Pittsburgh, and you look at those first 5, the dark bar is what they were in 1980. They're all right around 0, which again, remember, that's not bad. That means they were doing around the national average. So they were places, some a little bit above, some a little bit below, but broadly around the national trends. What here looks more like mustard, second bar is what was their score in 2016. And you see Detroit and Flint in particular really low. -1's a much, much lower score. It means you're kind of in that bottom quintile of counties, you're a long way out. And so they went from kind of being pretty close to the national average to way below. And when you look at Youngstown and Cleveland, also pretty sizable drops, not quite as large. And then you get to Pittsburgh and you see it's still right there. It's still just above the national average. Pretty close to where it was in 1980. And so it's the reason, frankly, I didn't make this slide for this group. This is what I talk about when I talk to people about this research, is Pittsburgh's a really fascinating case of a city that had a lot of manufacturing that is right around some of these other cities that got hit hard and yet somehow didn't fall into the same trap that they did. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of the reasons people think that is. Just to be clear that it's not just urban areas that suddenly fell off the map, it's actually the opposite. On average, you can see a bunch of other urban areas, whether it's Washington, D.C., Austin, New York, San Francisco, that went from either around average or, frankly, pretty far below in the dark green bar in 1980 to doing much, much better. In fact, Manhattan County, which is being shown for New York there, is one of the only places, I think it's like one of 2 or 3, that went from the bottom quintile to the top quintile over this period. And when we kind of ran the numbers and saw this, I honestly was thinking, is that right? Was New York really? Have we made a mistake somewhere? We were checking the code. And then actually I started thinking about, in 1980 we were making movies like Escape from New York, and Billy Joel was singing about sinking Manhattan out at sea. So, 1980 wasn't grand times for New York City. Obviously, that has reversed. You see San Francisco as one of the biggest movers in the index there, jumping up quite a bit. So what are some of the other factors more broadly? So in terms of economic resources, as we kind of talked about on the last panel, or I didn't, they did, talk about on the last panel, rural counties often lag in resources. They lag in job opportunities and economic resources more broadly. And so one of the things that really does stand out is if you kind of divide counties up by quintiles of how rural they are or how much of the county is rural, the counties that are most rural, kind of all the way over to the left there, are the ones that have lower, on average, lower economic vitality index scores. And so it highlights some of the challenges they face. Now, the most urban places also, many of them face challenges. So it's important, these are kind of broad averages across groups. It's not to say there are no rural counties in the top. There are actually quite a number of them, and that there are no rural urban counties in the bottom, as we just saw. Places like Detroit and Flint are often down in that bottom quintile now. But one of the things that jumps out is what's happening in rural counties. The other way you can see this is if you just look at job growth more recently. So if you look at job growth kind of in the economic recovery from 2011 to 18, one of the things you can see, or hopefully you can see, is if you look on the left figure there, it's what was job growth like dividing by the economic vitality index. And maybe it's not surprising, the ones that are kind of have been traditionally weaker economies are having much slower job growth. So in that sense, it's bad. They're not catching up. They're not kind of growing out of this. But one of the real reasons that's showing up actually is the urban-rural divide in the last decade, right? Which is that job growth in the rural is the lower line there, and it has been bouncing around close to 0 across this period, where job growth in urban counties has been going just much, much, much faster. And in fact, if you look, kind of take all the rural counties out and just look at urban counties, actually take all the suburban and rural counties out, look at the most urban counties, the ones that are lower on the economic vitality index or higher all have roughly the same job growth. So you're seeing urban counties growing. It's the rural counties that have not been growing on a population or job growth basis. Economic diversity winds up being a really interesting point, and this is what brings us back to Pittsburgh. When you look at counties, again, remember this, the kind of that mustard color is the more recent and the dark green is 1980. If you divide counties now instead by how much economic diversity do they have, and by that I mean you figure out what share of employment is concentrated in a small number of industries. So the places that are most concentrated are over on the far right here, the most concentrated. In 1980, they were just typical. They were right around average. But today, they've fallen much, much, much further below. And one way to think about this is every industry faces shocks at some point. The question is, in many ways, when you get a shock to your local industry, is there something else people can do? For that matter, if there's a shock to the main industry, are all the service jobs that are supporting people who have jobs in that industry, do they lose their jobs too? Because suddenly no one has a job. And it's one of the stories people tend to tell about Pittsburgh relative to Detroit or relative to Youngstown or relative to Flint, especially given the building we're in, right? A place that has a lot more higher education, a lot more healthcare, a lot more high tech that is often keying off the universities in the area, had options and had job options people could pivot to, and that industries and firms could pivot to, or it's not just jobs, often it's firms literally just change what they're doing. As the economy's evolving, the question is, do you have enough other things to evolve to? And that's one of the things that typically is viewed as the hallmark of Pittsburgh's success relative to these other ones. And the reason to show you this, because I'm guessing most of you have that story about Pittsburgh in your head, is that this shows up nationally. The places that had things to pivot to have, on average, been better off. The places that were really, really, really concentrated, the figure on the purple figure is just showing you the gap between those two bars over there. It's the places that were really concentrated that have just really struggled over the last 40 years. As I said, there wasn't that much movement in the vitality index. The biggest move you see is the highly concentrated counties didn't do as well. The other thing that is, I guess, in some sense obvious as part of that story is manufacturing was hit hard as well. So places that were really keyed off manufacturing, it used to be in 1980, being a manufacturing county meant you were above the national average. Today, being a high manufacturing county means you're a good amount below the national average in terms of overall economic success. And I should just say, actually, the only other thing about diversity there is the places that have almost no manufacturing still aren't, it's not like manufacturing's bad, I should highlight. The places that have no manufacturing aren't doing really well either, right? So it's being only manufacturing is the mark that seems like it's led to more trouble. Having some manufacturing and a blend of services and resource extraction and or agriculture, whatever it is, having a more diverse economy at the county level has often been a mark of more success. But the biggest predictor of how a county is doing is education. The figure on the left is dividing counties up by the share of the population that has less than a high school degree. And one thing that I should have highlighted before is the scale on this figure is just different. It's, when I look at how different counties were before, is often like a 0.2 or a 0.3. Here it's 1, which is just, and when you compare the counties that have the lowest number of people with less than a high school degree compared to the ones all the way at the bottom, it's really just the absolute gaps of the U.S. economy right there. The very top performing counties have very few people with without a high school education, and then vice versa. The counties that are struggling most are the ones that lack a high school education. I think it honestly goes back to some of the things that were being talked about on the last panel, which is when you think about the importance of community colleges and things like this as pathways to job success, without a high school education, you generally don't have access to those things, right? So the not having a high school education just becomes the ultimate barrier to any type of opportunity for advancement. It doesn't mean you need to necessarily go on to four-year degrees or get, I couldn't quite count how many degrees that was. That was a lot of degrees. It's not that we need everyone to have that many degrees. I have like 3, but I don't have that many. you not having a high school degree just limits the adult population so much in terms of their economic outcomes that it becomes the most important thing to solve in some ways. At the same time, college attainment is a huge marker too. Now, some of it is places with a lot of college graduates is just correlated with places that have very few people without a high school degree. But it's beyond that. Even if you kind of throw both in a regression, having a lot of college graduates matters a lot too. And so that's another important point. What's interesting, and I promise this is the last one of these crazy cloud pictures I'll show you, is that the places that don't have as many people with a high school degree have actually done a lot of catching up on that metric over the last 35 years. I know it's a little hard to read the scale there, but if you go back to 1980, there were a lot of places that 60% of the population did not have a high school degree. And what that figure is showing you is then how much did that change? And those places cut it by about 40 percentage points, right? So they go from like 60% not having a high school degree to 20% not having a high school degree. It's a huge improvement over the last 36 years and a huge testament to all the work that has been done around the country to try to lift graduation rates. Almost by default, the places that only had 10 or 15% of people without a high school degree could not have that much improvement, right? All they could do was go up 10 or 15 points, so they didn't go up as much. So on the one hand, you'd think, well, if this is so important, shouldn't that have meant that these places were catching up? The other hand, though, on the college, the percentage of population with college degrees, that gap has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. The more college graduates you have in 1980, the more gains in college graduation rates you had since then. And so we're seeing kind of this kind of sorting out of there are places with a lot more college graduates than there used to be compared to places that just don't really seem to be generating more and more college graduates. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and just very quickly mention one other piece, because it's important as to why we think policy here is so important, which is mobility is down too. So places aren't catching up. The poor places aren't catching up with the richer places, but also people used to move more. These lines are showing the rates of people that used to leave either the county or state they're in, and those have really come down over the last 40 years. And so on the one hand, places aren't catching up, and on the other hand, people aren't moving. And so that's the thing that often makes people think we probably need to think a lot more about policy. I want to quickly talk about a chapter, mostly just to flag it. It's not work I personally did, it's work we kind of reached out to some scholars and said, we're doing this volume on regional inequality, and one of the things we thought was really important was highlighting the role of race here, and the way in which racial inequality overlaps with regional inequality. And so just to flag this is from a chapter, I should say, by Bradley Hardy, Trevor Logan, and John Parman, who are terrific scholars in economic history and in this area. So one of the things they look at is just the share of the population that are African American across the country. And as you can obviously see, it's highly, highly unequal. This spatial distribution obviously maps a lot back to where people were in 1865, but also reflects a lot of kind of deliberate policy to keep people out of certain areas. And so you've got kind of a very, very strong concentration by race in the country. And then when you look at poverty, the maps line up in many ways. They don't line up perfectly. So if you look, for example, at Appalachia, there's a lot of poverty. It is not a heavily African American area. So it's not that these things overlap directly. Also, if you look at the Southwest, where there's a lot of Native American population that are quite poor, you see that show up on the map as well. But there is statistically a lot of overlap in terms of what's going on here. And so one of the things that they try to highlight in the chapter is just walk through some of the things that are so important to remember about this. And the reason to highlight this is because sometimes when we try to just not think about this aspect of things and come up with policy solutions that might help deal with some of the regional and place-based inequality, if we're forgetting some of the things that are actually causing that inequality, we can kind of miss the ball and not fix some of the problems that are in front of us. And so historically, whether it's lynching and mob violence, Jim Crow, residential segregation, all ways that kept deliberately, by policy, kept some people and some places poorer. That's one thing that creates this legacy of inequality in wealth and education and job opportunities that has clearly a racial component, but that gives it a regional component as well. But then there's still policies today that have very strong implications in this area. In particular, there's really large unequal access to the safety net. So people have done studies, places that have higher concentration of African American population actually enforce rules to keep people out of the safety net more strongly. You've got unequal access to public education in terms of funding, and you've got very, very unequal criminal justice outcomes that have huge economic implications for people's careers. And so when you layer all these things together, if we don't take these into account, it makes it a lot harder to fix some of the regional inequality problems that are important. So talking about some broader policy options, in the book we put together that you can go download for free on the website if you'd like, one of the things we did is reached out to a number of scholars to think through what they would do. And so I should say, economists have often been skeptical about place-based policies. And they're skeptical for a few reasons. One, the targeting is often terrible. If you look to see, did we target these policies towards the poorest places? Often we didn't do very well. Often it's not the poor residents who benefit, it's landowners. Just rents go up, and people don't necessarily get more jobs. And often there are real questions of efficiency around, well, should we be channeling resources at places that aren't productive? But again, as I think, or at least I hope I've sold the story, that when you think about the declining convergence and declining mobility, it's really important to move past that. And thinking of the, sometimes I'm shocked sometimes when I hear policymakers say, well, people just need to move. And that doesn't seem like a viable answer. It doesn't seem at least like the only answer you should be giving. And so just to tick through a few of them quickly, so one of our authors, David Newmark, put forward a policy he referred to as rebuilding communities' job subsidies. And so the idea here is that a lot of the places that are struggling, not only are they struggling with employment, but they're also struggling with their public goods because they just don't have enough resources. They don't have a tax base that can actually then generate enough money to clean up the parks or rebuild schools or rebuild community health centers. And so one thing you could do is, in his proposal, it's channeled from the federal level, but you could do this at a state level as well, which is target areas that are very high poverty areas, work with nonprofits in those areas to employ people, and so subsidize their employment to employ people to clean up the parks, rebuild the schools, staff community health centers, and things like that. But what you do in the process is give these people job skills and job training and job experience. Then over time, you transition them to private sector jobs that are again subsidized. And then after a certain amount of time, people are graduating out of this. At that point, though, they've had 3 years of job skills and job training and job experience and are far more employable. And the goal here, again, is to figure out ways to increase labor demand in the places that just don't seem to have enough labor demand, but at the same time, think about the public goods gaps that exist across places. You could also, though, just think about a better way to target resources. So Tracy Gordon's an economist in DC, and when we were talking to her about this project, she said, you don't need to do anything new, you just need to do what we do better. And she said, you know, we send billions and billions and billions, actually trillions of dollars around the country from the federal, in taxes to the federal government and then redistributed back out as grants. And we could just make sure those are targeted more smartly. Actually, think about the discussion about community colleges is, to me, as in the last panel, a similar story of saying we can't ask some counties to build their own community college. They just don't have the resources to do it. We shouldn't be asking the county to kick in a third. It should all be coming from the state. The story here is similar, is to say, you know, for example, with Medicaid is one of the larger programs that the federal government uses to push money back down to the states, is that you could, there is already a difference in the rate states get in Medicaid depending on poverty rates. You could just upweight that. You could just make sure the places that are poorest and have the weakest amount of economic resources themselves are getting more money back, whether it's through Title I or Medicaid or programs like that. But one that I think is highly relevant, and so this is probably one of the last ones I'll talk about to this room, is, because it does go back again to the story of Pittsburgh, is from a set of authors who wrote about how universities can help struggling regions. And so one of the things they talk about is just dropping a university in the middle of nowhere doesn't do it. Actually, they were all original faculty at the University of Merced, which was a university literally dropped in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't have a huge number of spillovers, at least for the first 20 or 30 or 40, well, we're not to 40 yet, 20 or 30 years. And so one of the things they talked about is how do you make sure the knowledge gets out of the university, that it's not just kind of behind a cloistered set of walls. And in particular, it talked about how manufacturing extension partnerships are actually a really good model of how you try to get, whether it's scientific knowledge or management knowledge or marketing knowledge, out of the universities and into firms, because what you want is to help the firms so that they will employ more people. And in particular, though, how do we figure out ways to make sure it's not just Allegheny County or the counties right next to Pittsburgh and the universities of Pittsburgh, or happen to have Penn State or Penn or some of the other great universities in Pennsylvania, but some of the other parts. How do you make sure some of the struggling counties are getting their share of that knowledge, and building manufacturing extension partnership centers in those places to partner with universities even if they're not right next to them. And then lastly, Stephen Smith's an economist who studies developing countries, and he points out that, you know, for 30 years, economists have been running experiments and doing really detailed studies in poorer countries, and there are a lot of lessons that we can take from this. And some of them that he highlights, again, is this idea of taking steps to increase high school completion, taking steps to improve health and nutritional outcomes, and there in particular making sure people are actually participating in the programs that they're eligible for, because not everyone is participating in them, and it's a way to channel resources to struggling communities. One of the important things there that he talks about is that there have been a lot of studies in poorer countries highlighting the huge mental strain of poverty, and the fact that when you are under that strain, it is often really hard to navigate the things that are put in front of you. You need to jump through to get to those resources, and trying to take steps to make it as easy as possible for people to get access to the health and nutritional educational resources they need, because, and you can wrap all these things together. You only need to qualify for these things once. You don't need to go through 20 different hoops for 20 different programs, as a way to try to channel resources towards places, and in particular people that are struggling. Some of the other things mentioned in there are actually gets around to this issue of connectivity and infrastructure that I think really touches on the rural broadband initiative people have talked about is incredibly important there. It's a way to try to connect places that aren't right next to the hub of economic activity, and make sure that they have people and firms in those places have a reason to locate there because they have a way to connect back to the rest of the economy. Lastly, I'll just say there are a million other ideas, and so I don't mean to just highlight those. And the reason I just end like this is to say almost any program people are talking, there are a lot of things we can do that help struggling places, ranging from broad-based job subsidies in poorer places or places with low labor demand, antitrust policy that tries to make sure you don't just have a few big firms located in a few areas that drive everything, down through a whole number of other things. There are things that we need to do to make sure people who do want to move towards the more like high productivity, high wage areas have those opportunities, fixing housing and education policies to help them do that, but crucially not assuming everybody wants to do that for some of the reasons talked about on the last panel, and trying to make sure we have better connectivity to those booming regions and better opportunities for people wherever they are. And I should say, just because this followed the rural panel, it's actually not just about rural areas. So, you know, some of the lowest performers on that economic vitality index are places like the Bronx, actually, and many other places. So the challenges, as mentioned in the last session, often between rural and urban are radically different, but sometimes the solutions are similar, whether it's access to jobs and access to training and access to education and nutritional programs. So I'll stop there and I think take questions now. So thanks.